We have a real treat for you tonight, but before I introduce our speaker, Dale Hall, I wanted to let you know on Friday, we're actually doing a double feature this week. We are going to have the world premiere of a film on probably one of our best Secretaries of Interior, Stuart Udall. So we're going to premiere a film called Stuart Udall and the Politics of Beauty, about an impressive Secretary of Interior, worked under John F. Kennedy, knew Rachel Carson, really helped kick off the modern environmental movement. And the filmmaker will be out here, and you will be the first people in the world to see it on a big screen, if you come. So that'll be this Friday at 7 p.m., and it's Stuart Udall, and the filmmaker, John DeGraff, will be out here with that. But tonight, you're in for a wonderful treat. Oh, I forgot the book. Hang on a sec. We have one of my favorite people back out here at NCTC, one of the first people I met when I was hired as a historian, Dale Hall. Dale Hall has quite an impressive resume. He has more than 40 years of professional experience in the fish and wildlife resource management in both the federal and private sectors. He served over 30 years in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with duties reaching across the U.S. And in the course of these assignments, Dale worked on nearly every high-profile environmental issue in America. He was a fisheries and wetlands biologist by training and spent a significant time working on the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act. In his last 3.5 years with our agency, he was nominated by President George W. Bush and confirmed by the Senate to be director, the highest position in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Dale is really bad at retiring. When he left us, he went on to become the CEO of Ducks Unlimited, Incorporated. For over 9 years, he helped that organization raise more than $2.3 billion and conserve more than 2 million acres of wetlands, grasslands, and waterfowl habitat. Outside of his resume, I can tell you Dale was one of the most inspiring directors we ever had in the Fish and Wildlife Service. He worked his way up through almost every possible job in the Fish and Wildlife Service. He connected with the employees like no other director has in my memory. He's an excellent educator, an excellent teacher. I've had the pleasure of reading his book twice. Just came out. It's called Compelled, From the Yazoo Pumps to Polar Bears and Back, The Evolution of Natural Resource Conservation and Law. It's got pictures of some of the species he worked for, including the northern spotted owl and the polar bear. I think you're really in for a treat. And now I'll turn it over to Dale Hall.
Thank you, Mark. We really didn't test this. Is this coming across okay? Can everybody hear me okay? Good. Well, as Mark said, when I retired, I'm not really good at it. And so even when I retired from Ducks Unlimited, I wasn't really good at it. So I had decided that I wanted to write a book. When I started on it, I thought I would just write it for my children. You know, where was Dad all these years? Because working for the Fish and Wildlife Service, I was always on the road 50, 60, 70% of the time. And I thought I was gathering information to really write for them so that they would know what was going on. And then issue after issue that I was kind of thrust into, I didn't really ask, I showed up and there they are, caused me to start keeping duplicate files. So over my career with the Fish and Wildlife Service and Ducks Unlimited, I just boxed things up, court cases, internal memoranda, letters, everything that had to do with an issue that I was working on, and I did work on all of these issues. I didn't write about anything I didn't work on myself. And so when I got through, I had 40 boxes. And those of you with the Fish and Wildlife Service or have moved around know that when you move, you get those little different color stickers put on your boxes. I had some boxes that had a whole lot of stickers on them. They've been following me around for a long time. So I winnowed that down from about 40 boxes down to about 20 because I said, I just simply can't cover all of these. The book would be too big. It's 500 pages as it is with the dozen or so issues that I did choose. And so I winnowed it down to about 20 boxes and then started writing from there. And then as I started going through it, it originally was going to be, like I said, for my children, so it was going to be an autobiography with the things I worked on, and I realized nobody cares about the autobiography stuff, so I pulled that out. And this book is really about you. And that's when I came to understand what I was writing about, I knew I wanted to. The title of the book is called Compelled. And I chose that, and I had a lot of different names I went through, but I chose it because of you. When I worked in both the government and in the non-government sector, what I found was the common trait. Everyone that works in conservation feels like they're driven to be involved. They can't walk away from it. And so I chose Compelled because of the way that you and the people that I was privileged to work with in my career inspired me, kept me going, carried me, made sure that I didn't fall too far. And then we as a team succeeded. And I want you to understand two things here as we go through. Number one, everything I'm going to talk about is team. We do this together. Either we do it together or it doesn't get done. No one of us is good enough to get it done. I'm sorry if your ego says you can, it can't. It takes all of us to do it. And the other is that in order to really make progress, we need to be better listeners than we are talkers. So those are the two things I'd like you to keep in mind as we walk through this. As I came out of the hills of eastern Kentucky, I grew up in Harlan County, coal mine country. I never dreamed I'd be standing here tonight talking to you about national policy. But the hand of my Creator had other ideas and pushed me wherever I was going, and that's how I'm here, and I know what happened. It sure wasn't what I planned, because I didn't plan any of it this way. I thought I was going to be a dentist. But when I started getting into it, I realized that there's a lot of different understanding of policy and the environmental conflicts, we love to call them, environmental issues, conservation conflicts, all the battles. We even put that kind of term on them. And we try to put it on people. And I think that what I want to try and share with you tonight is my learning experience as I went through my career. Starting as a GS7 biologist, a wetlands biologist working in Vicksburg, Mississippi in the lower Mississippi Valley, and having being thrust into the first WOTUS court case. Most people don't even know it existed. Waters of the U.S. is under the Clean Water Act, and it's a term that is really a hot one because it says what gets regulated and what doesn't. Most people don't even know we had a WOTUS case in 1978 through 80, but we did. And it was to bring bottomland hardwood wetlands under the jurisdiction of Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. Starting there and moving through the issues, I picked a few tonight as examples. They're all in the book, but I picked a few to try and help you see how I learned and how I grew, because in the end, what we're trying to do is have policy mean something. So we're going to start off here with definitions because we need to be on the same page. We all talk about policy, but these are Dale Hall definitions, so you can disagree with them if you want. But for me, policy is the formal expression of the will of the people, plus the appropriate information to go with it. The formal expression of the will of the people. That can be a law, it can be a regulation, it can be an ordinance, it can be saying you can't keep your bar open past 2 in the morning because you're going to bother the neighbors. It can say all kinds of things, but the policy is a formal expression of the will of the people, at least the majority. In policy, there's nothing really wrong with that, but we in government have the responsibility to carry out that policy. I'm going to be talking for my life in the executive branch of government and then right at the end in my private sector. But everything I say here, keep in mind, I'm talking about sitting in the chairs that you sit in working for the Fish and Wildlife Service or maybe another federal agency or whatever. So it's the executive branch of government that my eyes are looking at these things with. But policy is just not enough. It's not enough. That's how we become bureaucrats and get called bureaucrats. Just read the law, carry it out, say no. What is good policy? Good policy is the formal expression of the will of the people, plus the appropriate information, plus wisdom and application. The wise execution of the policy. Listening to all the different views that are out there. They're conflicting. How do we find that ground that is a solution? How to win a solution. Over and over tonight, I'm going to tell you that. I never was after a win. I want a solution. Because if we win, somebody loses. And whoever lost, as soon as it's back in power, we're going to fight that same battle all over again. So what we want is a solution that people can live with and accept. So we want good policy, which is wise application of the express will of the people. Look at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service mission. It says the same thing. Working with others, conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. I always called that the sandwich mission. You went through ALDP early, and you know that I would have that thing out there and say our mission is a sandwich mission. It begins and ends with people, and the meat of the sandwich is the natural resources. But our responsibility is to take care of those natural resources working with the people at both ends. Understanding how we get there and understanding who it's for. Whether we like it or don't like it, we carry out those laws, the will of the people. We don't get to change them, so it doesn't matter whether we like it. Our responsibility is to give the people back what they asked for. And that's what I believe we try to do at the Fish and Wildlife Service. So what I'm giving you tonight is nothing new. It's been there ever since we wrote the mission statement. Good policy equals good government. And when we have that, unfortunately, we often end up with conflicting policies. It's not people that are in conflict. It's policies that are in conflict. It could be timber harvest versus old growth forests. I'll talk a little bit about that tonight. It could be flood control versus ecosystem conservation. They're both, all of those are policies of the American people. It's when they come in conflict with each other in an area that we in the executive branch have the responsibility to sit down and figure out the compromise solution that will help us get through things. What is the hidden solution, though, to achieve this wisdom that we're looking for? The only real power that any of us has is that which we share. We in the executive branch are given the laws, the regulation, and the authority to go out there and in some cases regulate. But I'm saying we can go out there and tell somebody, no, you can't do that on your property. We're given that kind of authority. But is that the right thing to do when we're really trying to work to find solutions? When we exclude entities impacted by policy decisions, we send the message of disrespect and we create adversaries. I say in my book, in the foreword that I wrote, that I never met anyone that wasn't ready to work in conservation if I approached them with respect, and that all controversy begins with accusation. And as soon as we accuse, we've got an issue. When we ask, will you help, we have an ally. We have the authority. Nothing in the law tells us that we can't, so we need to throw that table open and invite people to come sit with us and say, how can you help us solve this issue? We have these conflicting policies here. How can you help us get there? How can you help us make that happen? When we do that, we have the opposite. When we invite those entities to the discussion table, we show respect and we create allies in search of solutions. It's all in how we approach it that makes the difference. The laws stay the same, regulations stay the same. Our latitude in implementing them is what really makes the difference. So I'm going to give you a few examples tonight of the things that I went through. The Avoyles Sportsman's case is that first WOTUS case, Waters of the U.S., 1978 to 1980. I'm going to give you a quick summary and then I'll move through it. On each of these issues, I'll do that. Bottomland Hardwood Wetlands was not considered to be a part of Waters of the U.S. I don't care how often they flooded, unless it was a cypress or Tupelo gum. I mean the wettest of the wet, it wasn't considered to be a wetland. Now, science could have had another thing, but the Corps of Engineers didn't think so. And the problem came in because of the conflicting policies. See, the Corps of Engineers have been running the Rivers and Harbors Act since 1899. And in the Rivers and Harbors Act, their role was to help make sure that the rivers of this country were open for navigation, because the rivers were the highways in the 1800s for commerce movement. And so the Corps of Engineers had the responsibility to make sure you couldn't build a pier, or a dock, or a bridge, or a dam, or something that would block navigation, and take care of it. And so they thought, well, this is what we'll do. We don't really care about those floodplain wetlands. They're not part of navigation. So they didn't want to protect them. So this small group of people in Avoyelles Parish, Louisiana, central Louisiana, got together and sued the Corps of Engineers because a massive land clearing was going on of bottomland hardwood wetlands that literally flooded every year all over, and at worst every 2 years you could drive a boat over the whole property. And the Corps was saying it's not wet because it didn't have the right plant species. It wasn't cypress tupelo all over, and so they just said no, it's not there. This group got together and sued them because they wanted to make sure that those bottomland hardwood wetlands got gone. And why were they so concerned about it? Let's have a little history. Historically, over 24 million acres of bottomland hardwood wetlands were in the lower Mississippi Valley. We consider the lower Mississippi Valley, people will argue about it. You can say either it starts at Memphis or it starts at Cairo, Illinois, but from there down is considered the lower Mississippi. Historically, that floodplain was 100 miles wide. Before levees were constructed, the floodplain was 100 miles wide. And so the federal government didn't think we had this kind of responsibility to get involved with that Corps of Engineers, is who we're talking about, because they had the Rivers and Harbors Act, and there was enough in that river to allow navigation. They didn't need to worry about all these other floodplains. So what did they do next? When I was a biologist sitting in Vicksburg, Mississippi as a GS7, going through old files, trying to write a report on the Yazoo Basin, I ran across a pamphlet from the Corps of Engineers. Guess what was in bold letters all across the top? God creates floods, man creates flood damage. That was the policy of the federal government up until the 1930s. The Corps of Engineers, that was their pamphlet that said that. That wasn't a Fish and Wildlife pamphlet or somebody else's. That was the Corps of Engineers pamphlet. Telling people, you want to build in a floodplain, you and God deal with the results of what happens there. We're not going to come in and do it. So why, given what we're talking about with the Avoyelles case having to come in, with 19 million acres possibly being gone, what is it that we're talking about that caused that change? Oops, sorry. The Great Flood of 1927 occurred. There was also the flood of 28, 34, and 36. All of those were catastrophic type floods that really filled that 100-mile wide floodplain. And so what happened was the Dust Bowl era came in, the Great Depression came in, and Franklin Roosevelt needed to create jobs. Another policy. Remember, economic policy comes in on a lot of these things too. Roosevelt created the 3 C's, what we call them, the Citizen Conservation Corps. They built a lot of facilities. It put people to work building Forest Service lodges and out on Yellowstone. I think the lodge at Yellowstone was built by the 3 C's. They're putting people to work. Well, Roosevelt turned to the Corps of Engineers and said, we got to put more people to work. You just had all these floods out there. The Corps said, sir, we don't do floods. He said, I'm the president. I want you to go look and see what you can do. So they came back and they said, okay, if you want us to, we can do it. We can build levees and we can do things. So the very first Corps of Engineers flood control project was on the lower Mississippi River, right along the river, the mainline Mississippi levees. And guess what that protected? That protected the Yazoo Basin and a lot of that area over into Louisiana. And as we looked at that, in 73, but it could have been 63, R.C. Marshall was the general of the Lower Mississippi Valley Division of the Corps of Engineers, and he gave this bold, proud statement that the Corps of Engineers flood control projects had done away with and converted 19 million of the 24 million acres of bottomland hardwood wetlands that were in the Lower Mississippi Valley. So all of a sudden we had the conflict between flood control and conservation, and trying to make a living, commercial fishing and all those sorts of things were starting to come in, but they really weren't bubbling that hard then. People wanted to come out of the Depression. We need to remember that in the Dust Bowl, it wasn't central U.S. only. There are photographs of people standing on the streets on Manhattan Island and they can't see the Hudson River for the dust. The dust covered everywhere. People were just leaving their homes that literally dust was halfway up the house. To just leave it. They just walked away from them because they couldn't do it anymore because that was bad policy. Everyone thought all the soils out west were just as suitable for growing crops as the ones in this rich alluvium that we've been used to growing them in. So they sent them out there, they turned it over, and those soils were not ready to grow. They just blew away. And therefore, you had the Dust Bowl. Roosevelt needed a change. He created this new paradigm of flood control. And we had the Flood Control Act of 36 and the 40s. When I say 40s, I mean 41, 43, 44, 46. There were a bunch of them that came in, all to do flood control. So all of a sudden we had a whole new policy in the federal government. And then that went on for a while, and then there was this spurt of about five years, from 1968 or so to 73. Well, I would call them the most dramatic 5-year period in the history of American conservation. We started off with the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act. Then we had the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, and probably another couple I'm not recalling, all done between 69 and 73. And what this one did, and I believe though that the 69 Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, may be the most powerful law ever created. I know the Supreme Court has said the Endangered Species Act is, but truth is always more powerful than any regulation. And the National Environmental Policy Act says that you will give full disclosure of all impacts, both social, economic, and environmental, of every project you as a federal agency are going to do, and you're going to have alternatives to evaluate on how you can accomplish your objective, and each one of those alternatives is going to have to show the full impact on those three issues and what it would mean. It's called a full disclosure. It is not a decision document. The decision document is called the record of decision. One of those alternatives or a couple of them is chosen out, and that's how you come up with the answer. But anyway, these laws were passed. The Clean Water Act was one of them. At the time, it was called the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. This was the most bipartisan act. They overruled the veto from President Nixon. The Congress and the whole Congress, both the House and the Senate, both parties overruled him because rivers were catching fire. We were having real pollution problems, and all of a sudden everybody got together and said, we have to have clean water. So let's have the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. Most laws have a 5-year sunset. They have to be reauthorized every 5 years. This is one of them. So in 1978, they did what was called the Clean Water Act amendments. And that's why we call it the Clean Water Act today. And it changed some things in there that were pretty significant. When they were putting it together, this is what Senator Muskie said on the floor of the Senate about wetlands. For anybody that thought wetlands weren't supposed to be included, he said, first, there is the problem of protecting wetlands. That is one of national interest. There's no question that the systematic destruction of the nation's wetlands is causing serious ecological damage. So when they passed the Clean Water Act amendments, no doubt they intended to protect wetlands because of what they do for us. They purify kidneys, all the different things, flood control, all of those things. They intended to do that. So when they wrote it, they said, okay, here's the Clean Water Act. Look at the purpose. It says the purpose of the Clean Water Act is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. Chemical, physical, and biological integrity. Nowhere is navigation mentioned. 2 different laws being used to try and say they were won by the Corps of Engineers. They were using the 1899 Rivers and Harbors Act to say that it should fit this law, which has nothing to do with navigation. It has to do with the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And then in there, they had to go in and give a definition of what a wetland is. Unfortunately, you got to deal with me on this one. This is bureaucratic, but it's also very important because words in law and regulation mean things. It says a wetland is an area that is inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, and under normal circumstances does support, vegetation that is typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. That's a mouthful of gobbledygook, but to us scientists it means a lot. What it's telling us that is a wetland is an area that gets flooded either from underground or above ground, often enough during the growing season that it drives out all of the oxygen out of the soil, so the soil is saturated. There's no oxygen in the soil for the tree to get. These are all terrestrial plants, remember. Water saturation is a stress on that plant. So then the plant has to have adaptations to be able to live in there. Now, we had just come out in 1980 with Coard et al., which was a publication of Wetlands and Deep Water Habitats of the United States. It had these three in there, but it said any one of them will make it a wetland. But when we got into this court case, we realized that words matter and that the law matters. So science needs to be applied to the words of the law. So we said, Fish and Wildlife Service said this, all three of those need to be present before it is a regulated wetland. Must have that inundation or saturation, must have saturated soils, and you must have vegetation that has shown adaptations. That's very important in this court case. It was to us because there were features of that biological and chemical integrity of the waters that needed to be talked about. Fish spawning and nursery grounds, wildlife habitat, etc., are mentioned in the law. So then we went on, and the judge gave us a lesson on what really policy is. This was beautiful. His name was Norman Scott. He was the federal district judge in the Western District of Louisiana. And in his opinion, he wrote this: the plaintiffs in this proceeding are representatives of those who fought historically to expand Section 404 jurisdiction to promote pollution control. Private defendants are representatives of those who have fought historically for the right to clear and develop forest lands. Remember that under the Constitution of the United States, our individual rights are there, and the government has a responsibility before we can infringe on them. Those private landowners felt like it's my right to go out and clear these lands. I own them. Unfortunately for them, in America, we the people own fish, wildlife, water, and air. The landowner cannot own those. And so this judge then understood that and kept going. Thus, the wetlands definition does not answer a scientific need. It satisfies a practical, a social, a political need. The need to define the scope of 404 jurisdiction. It needs to define the scope that allows the government to intrude on that private landowner. It is a practical solution. It is a social solution. It is a political solution. You notice he even says it is not a scientific need. Science is there to help us. And what he said, though, this is my interpretation of what he said. He said the Corps of Engineers' application of Section 404 is incorrect. The EPA's was correct. And that the Rivers and Harbors Act versus the Clean Water Act didn't satisfy what the Corps was trying to do. Two different policies fighting each other over the definition of what they were supposed to accomplish. And they were driven by protecting their traditional power base. The Corps did not want to give up its authority to regulate. They didn't want the EPA stepping in here, but unfortunately for them, the Congress had given EPA the authority over the Clean Water Act. And we even had to get that settled during the court case. The issue is still alive today. These issues don't go away. It's one of the things you can either love or hate about policy. There will always be arguments about it. Today, the Trump administration came in and changed the definitions in the regulation and actually said in regulations for 404 that now it must be just a surface water connection, had to flood over. But they didn't go change the definition of a wetland. The definition of a wetland is still in that same regulation that says either surface or groundwater. So the Sacketts out in Idaho filled in a big wetland area to build their house on it. Corps of Engineers gave them a cease and desist order, told them to get out. They sued. It's now in front of the Supreme Court. And what we have is a conflicting policy on its face. Because in one part of the regulation it says it has to be a surface water connection, and in the definition of a wetland it says it can be either surface or subsurface. And so this is one of the things that constantly lives in policy. There will always be somebody that will come up and try and make an argument, and we'll just have to wait and see what the Supreme Court says about it now. Science is never the answer. This is one of the things that I learned in this. I learned two things here. In this case, as I was a growing biologist, I learned that science is never the answer. It is partial information used to formulate a decision. Remember that. Science is ever evolving, so it's never firm. We are learning every day. That's why we love it. And so we have to understand that science is information that has to be used in conjunction with practical, political, and social needs as we move forward. And wise implementation of laws and regulations force us to consider that. Another thing that I learned is that the executive branch responsibilities, when infringing on individual rights protected by the U.S. Constitution, the burden of proof is on us, not with the citizen. If the government's going to come onto the property and do something or tell you you can't do something, the burden is on us and the government to prove that. What happened here was that there was improper interpretation of the will of the people in that the Corps chose to use the Rivers and Harbors Act instead of the Clean Water Act. We had to come back in with EPA and with the private plaintiffs and argue that, hey, we're talking about the Clean Water Act here. So I learned those two things there. Each place I learned something to carry forward. The next one had nothing to do with wetlands at all. This goes to the other part of the world, up in the Northwest Forest and the northern spotted owl. So how did this thing come about? How did this little bird cause all of that controversy? Those of you that are old enough to remember know that it was on the front page every day. I know because I was out there and I was the point person for the Fish and Wildlife Service trying to bring this thing to resolution, working with the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service and the other agencies, but those two mainly, to try and come up with a solution. So what had happened to cause this little thing so much controversy? When after World War II, there was a big need that came about to have a supply of raw materials to build houses. We have World War II veterans coming home. The GI Bill had just been passed. Again, those of you that are old enough will remember that said that a veteran can go ahead and buy a home with no down payment. They can get a loan from the VA. It's called a VA loan, interesting enough. And you don't have to have a down payment on the house. Well, these guys coming home didn't have the money, so this was great. Well, they had to have houses. So all of a sudden, the national forests, whether they were owned by BLM or the Forest Service, became the place for the products to come out of to build those homes. So for 30 years, timber sales became the norm on national forest lands, whether they were BLM or forest, national forests. And what that means is they would bid out, the Forest Service or BLM would bid out, come in and do these timber sales, come in and do the cuts, and instead of doing them the way they should have been done, they did them, which would be selective harvest. Those of you that know anything about forestry know that you go in, you mark the trees you need to take out so that the other trees can grow better, faster, and also reduce the fuels in the forest for fires. Well, they didn't do that. There was such a hunger to have that they allowed the people that were in political positions to make the decisions. That's a bad choice. People in political positions should almost never make the choice on natural resource management, on whether or not nature can sustain it. Again, get the information from the scientist and then make a decision that is judged against the science, but they didn't. So we had the chief of the Forest Service, we had the head of BLM sitting in front of Congress saying, no problem, we can get you 3 billion board feet every year out of these forests. Well, a board foot is a 1 foot square plank 1 inch thick. That's a board foot. 1 inch, 12 inches, 12 inches, 1 inch. So they look at a tree and decide how many board feet can come out of that, because that tells you how much lumber can come out and how much they can make. Well, guess what? Old growth forest, you could take one section of one tree, and a log truck could hardly hold it. It was so big. That's why they were called old growth. And so they changed all of their tooling out there, and they went to these big saws to cut up the big logs so that they could get the most timber the quickest, and they were doing it in a very irresponsible manner. Instead of selective harvest, they were doing mountainside clearing. This nature cannot sustain. Nature cannot replace you taking whole mountainsides down in 1 year and expecting it to be replaced. So this was happening out there that caused all the controversy. So then they got sued. The evolution started with the poor policy of the elected officials saying, hey, no problem, we can get all this board timber out of here you want. We can do it. And the scientists, by the way, and the land managers were saying, we can't do this. They were documenting that we can't do this. Nature can't sustain this. But the powers that be wanted jobs, and so they kept pushing it. good policy emerged through the National Environmental Policy Act. I told you about that one. The Endangered Species Act and the National Forest Management Act. There was another law in there called Federal Policy Lands Management Act. That's the one that the BLM works under. Those laws are the ones that all the court cases came through. Out of about 13 cases that went to trial, and I think somewhere between 10 and 12 judges, only 2 had to do with the Endangered Species Act. Listing of the northern spotted owl and critical habitat for the northern spotted owl. After that, the spotted owl was a surrogate species under the National Forest Management Act for old growth forest. It was the species that was supposed to tell you if those forests are healthy or not. If the owl gets in trouble, old growth forests were in trouble. The National Forest Management Act said that the Forest Service must manage to have viable populations of all vertebrate species. Now, how can you manage to have viable populations of all vertebrate species and have that? You know, I once told Jack Ward Thomas, I'll be glad to work with you when owls can have a nest on a stump, roost on a stump, and feed on a stump. But until they do, we're not cutting any more trees. Because that was the conflicting policy that was going on. The hunger for more timber, cheap timber, and then trying to take care of these other laws that were conflicting policies. Those conflicting policies led to a lack of trust. And a lack of trust, of course, justified, led to court cases. All those court cases went through. So we finally ended up coming out with the Federal Ecosystem Management Assessment Team. I'll say it again because I stumbled. The Federal Ecosystem Management Assessment Team, called FEMAT, was the forest product that came out from all the agencies saying how all the forests should be managed. Courts upheld it. It's lived. It's kept going. The only problem we have is trust was never built back. The environmental community never gained trust again for BLM and the Forest Service. So when those thinning sales that we recommended in the plan that we wrote, we recommended that those thinnings take place to reduce the fuels and to allow the other trees to grow so the habitat could come back faster. The environmental groups out there did not trust that the Forest Service would do that, so they went to court to try and block all the timber sales. So now, today, we don't have overharvest as the largest threat to the northern spotted owl. We have catastrophic wildfires and the invasion of the barred owl because the tree stands are simply too thick, and now those western fires are showing us what we should have been doing. But the lack of trust is what caused that. I'm not going to criticize the environmental community because they have a right not to have trust. But at some point, you need to come to the table and say, okay, I'm willing to listen to you. I'm willing to be there. If you want me, I'll even come out on the ground and make sure you do it right. But at some point, you got to start working together. And I don't believe that they've done that, and I think they need to do that. And maybe we can move forward and really get this thing fixed if that happens. The next issues that I want to work on is to go south of that down into California water. California water has been around for 100 plus years, and the war's over water because out west it's dry. Unlike the Corps of Engineers trying to get rid of all the floodwaters in the lower Mississippi, out west they'd love to have it. Because out there, the Bureau of Reclamation has to deliver water for irrigation so that they can grow them. So then you had conflicts there. I don't know who said it. Mark Twain is credited with saying it, but also a Bureau of Reclamation employee is credited with saying it, but it's true. Out west, whiskey is for drinking, water's for fighting over. And when I sat down with groups there, when I was working out in California on these water issues, I would pull in the enviros, the agriculture, and the municipals together around the table. And at one point I turned to one of them, I said, how much water do we really need to get the salmon smolt down the Sacramento and out into San Francisco Bay? He looked at me with not a hesitation. Said, more. I said, okay, you're done. I turned to agriculture and I said, how much water can you grow your almonds or potatoes or whatever? Can you really, how many acre feet would you need to do that? An acre foot of water, like a board foot, is 1 acre of water 1 foot deep. And so out there we had 8 million acre feet of water that we were dealing with to work with. So I would ask them, how many acre feet do you need? He looked at me and never batted an eye and said, more. I turned to municipal, and Tim Quinn was there representing Metropolitan Water District. He said, if they're not telling, I'm not telling. I said, you guys have been fighting each other so long, you don't even know why. You just want to hurt each other. And so you're out. Now that guy sitting down at the end of the table, Roger Patterson, the regional director of the Bureau of Reclamation, he and I and our staffs, we're going to tell you what you get now. You just lost your opportunity. So have a safe drive home, but you're out of it. And what David Bahar with the Bay Institute looked at me and said, don't put that on me. I said, I think I just did. You guys need to understand that you live here together and you need to sit together and talk together. We're willing to. We're willing to share this power with you right now. It's laying on the table for you to take, and you won't take it. So that was the issue that was there. And so how did we end up dealing with it? There were the three major issues: Central Valley of California, the Central Valley agriculture, environmental and species needs, cities and people for health and recreation. And by the way, when there's a water conflict, health and safety comes before everything else. The homes, the hospitals, that's going to get water first. It's just the way it is. I don't care. The Secretary of the Interior is the water master out there, and I guarantee you that health and safety will take precedent over everything else out there. Human life is more important. And we're going to make sure that happens, and that's in policy, and that's the way we carry it out. So when we got together to try and figure out how are we going to solve this issue, we got people that won't talk to each other. And so again, we had my real partner there with the Bureau of Reclamation. Fish and Wildlife Service and Bureau of Reclamation were side by side. We would not let them divide us the way they historically had, one representing the delivery and the other representing the enviros. I told them whatever Roger told them, I'll back it up. They said, and Roger said whatever Dale says, I'll back it up. That's what you need, that teamwork, that trust with each other. We had it at the federal level, but we needed to make it bigger. So we went and looking at the Sacramento, San Joaquin Bay. We first started out with that relationship that we had. We brought EPA in. Felicia Marcus was there as their regional administrator of EPA. The three of us got together and laughed and called it Club Fed. At the time, those of you old enough, there was a Club Med, which was a big vacation place that you could go around the world and about half punch drunk at night, we just said, why don't we just call ourselves Club Fed? So we did. But then we realized that's not enough. That's not the whole team. We need the state of California in here with us because they manage the water too. So then we went to Cal Fed, California Federal. Then we realized that's still not enough. We don't have the environmental and the other users in here at the table. And when we come up with this, it's just going to be another fight later. We got to get them to the table too. So we brought them in. We've been learning over time how to do this. So we brought it in, and then we had what was called Cal Fed Bay Delta. The Bay Delta interests there were the enviros, were the hunting groups, the farmers, everybody that was in there. And we had everybody. And what did we get out of it? We got what was called the Bay Delta Accord. It wasn't what everybody wanted, but it was what everybody could live with. That Bay Delta Accord lasted well over 10 years. It still is the model, I would say, to come back and fix any issues that come up today with water, even in the drought, because you had everybody at the table and everybody understood what the challenges were and everybody understood what the solutions had to be. So we have been learning throughout my career how to do this the right way. This was the first time that we really, I think, got it right. And we learned how to bring everybody to the table and make it work. The next thing that came up was in the lower Colorado River. Those of you that may know about the Colorado is composed of 7 states. 4 states are in the upper basin, 3 states in the lower basin. I was in Albuquerque at the time as the regional director, and I needed to work with the lower Colorado River MSCP. So what the hell is an MSCP? A multi-species conservation plan. Under the Endangered Species Act, there's 2 ways that you can take a species. You can actually harm or kill, or you can impact them. One is a Section 7 consultation that is done with government from a federal agency to a federal agency. And then for those that are non-federal, there's a Section 10 permit. Section 10 of the law allows us to give them a permit to do the same thing. It's equity in allowing both the federal and the non-federal entities out there to have the same access to be able to have a project if they do it right. And so we evaluate them the same way to make sure no jeopardy will occur, et cetera, and you go on. Well, in the lower Colorado, we had a lawyer for every entity. And you know what that means. I'm not criticizing lawyers. My daughter is a lawyer is an attorney with the Department of Interior Solicitor's Office in Atlanta. And so I'm not critiquing lawyers. You're there to protect your client. But when you're protecting your client, you're not caring about anybody else. You're telling them to take the strongest stance they can take to get their interests taken care of. This thing had gone on for almost 10 years. So we literally got everybody in the same boat. What does that mean? We floated the lower Colorado River down through Grand Canyon. And we had the state of Arizona, Nevada, and California. Had me from the Arizona, New Mexico side, and my buddy Steve Thompson from Nevada and California. And we literally talked about how to deal with water issues and how we could get it done. And we built trust on that trip. I'm back to this because that's the only way it's going to work. They understood we really wanted to listen. We wanted to find a solution. When they believed that, they started opening up. They being the states, started opening up. And so by the time it was over, we had agreed that we would have a phone call and we resolved this. I told them, I'll make a decision. And if you'll do the things that we've talked about doing, I'll sign the permit. Or I'll say that it should be signed. And so we did. We had a phone call. I had all of them on the phone. And we talked about how we're going to do it. And I asked on the phone, I said, now, no lawyers can be on the phone. I'm sorry, the time for legal advice is over. It's time for management to make decisions. So we had the Metropolitan Water District that feeds water to California. We had the Water Master for Nevada and the Water Master for Arizona on the phone. And we started talking about how to get things fixed. In 1 hour's time of agreeing, of offering counteroffers, coming up with compromises, we had agreed on $620 million to go to the lower Colorado River for fish, wildlife, and other species in return for an assurance of water delivery at certain levels coming down the lower Colorado River. We had learned to do that because we knew we needed those people at the table. We needed them there to agree because I'm gone from there now. That thing's still alive. That permit is still living. I've had people criticize me because my own attorney wouldn't sign off on it. My own attorney said, no, you're not getting enough assurances that they're going to pay. I said, Justin, I can pull the permit tomorrow. We controlled the permit the whole time. I didn't have to tell them that. They knew that. I never waved it at them. I never told them you had to. But they understood. But they also understood I didn't want to ever do that. So they're not going to break this. Because they can only lose. If they don't hold up their end, we pull the permit. They don't get water. What do you think that means? So when you sit down with people and work with them, that trust builds. And I hope that permit never has to be pulled. And I hope that $620 million has done everything and is doing everything it was supposed to do. Because it works when you get people at the table. The last one on the list as far as issues are concerned is the polar bear. My good friend Jim Mosher back there and I worked on this together. And this was a tough one because it was the first time that we have been petitioned to have a species listed over global warming. I mean, think about it. We had never had an issue where ice was the driving factor. You see, the polar bear is what we call a platform feeder. That's why if you ever see a polar bear paw, it is big and it's round, not very big claws, but a whole lot of big pads on it. That's for pads or for gripping that ice and working on ice. They will sit on those floating platforms of ice, those ice sheets, and there's what they call haul-out holes that the ringed seals will just pop up out of the water up onto the ice, shake off, and be staring at a polar bear. That's the polar bear's number one food. Well, what was happening is that summer ice when the polar bear's feeding was melting, no platform to feed on. The seals were where they needed to be. They're over the continental shelf feeding on fish because that's the fish are over the continental shelf where the habitat is. But the ice is gone now from the continental shelf in the summer, so we're having real issues here. The physical attributes of the bears were going down. They were getting thinner, smaller, more, not as healthy. And this is all over. So the big issue was we had 27,000 bears circumpolar, and we had the range states here. Everybody agreed to that, but they all agreed something was happening, and they never argued with us listing it, by the way. So we ended up listing the polar bear, but one of the sad parts about that was a conflicting policy. I talked to the class about this right before we came on here. Under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Marine Mammal Commission allows polar bears and other mammals to be taken by Aboriginals. Under Aboriginal rights, they can take them. And they're considered dead bears because they're for their culture, they're for food, they're for everything, scrimshaw, whatever they want to do with them, whether they be walrus or polar bear or whatever. They're allowed to do it. So the bears that would be killed in Canada, for example, are going to be killed anyway because the only ones that have the right to do it are the Aboriginals, those villages up there of the First Nation people. And that's appropriate under every law we have, from the Endangered Species Act on through. The Bald and Golden Eagle Act is the same way. So that's normal. But what happens in the Marine Mammal Protection Act is that it says if a species gets listed under the Endangered Species Act, it automatically becomes considered a depleted population under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And the rules under the Marine Mammal Protection Act say that you may not import any product from a depleted population species. So all we did in that process, in trying to avoid it, because all the range states said hunting was no issue. That was not an issue. The ice. It's all about the ice melting. And yet, here we go. If a hunter wants to go to Canada and take a bear and bring that lifetime memory back home with him or her, they can't do it now because of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So the result is the Aboriginal village did not get the $20,000 that they would have gotten from the hunt, 10,000 of which went into the bear conservation program to try and augment and help take care of the bears. So all of that was lost over policy conflict. So unintended consequences is almost always present in these conflicts. And when we listed the bear, not a thing we could do to help it. We can't stop ice from melting. The Endangered Species Act can't do that. We can't trace molecules of CO2 from India or China and say that's what caused the ice to melt in Alaska or around the pole any more than we can trace it from a power plant in Texas. So we couldn't do anything using these other acts to protect it. It did bring attention to the reality that the ice is melting and the earth is warming, but we still ended up with some conflicts. The last part of my career, I worked in the private sector where I learned more openly about the citizen conservationist. I write about it in the book. Oh, what did I do? Did I turn it off? All right, sorry, it just says citizen conservationist. I don't know what happened. There was one more. It says good policy belongs to everyone, all of us. And when people are fighting over the issues, they're fighting out of fear. We need to remember that. All the names I've been called in my career, all the things that have happened, they didn't happen because somebody hated me. They happened because they were so afraid of what might happen, and I represented what might happen. That they might not be able to send their kids to college. They might not be able to pay their bills. They might lose their homes. Their jobs might go away. At critical habitat hearings, I had long 12-foot boards brought in and laid in front of me, all signed by mill workers saying they lost their jobs because of the spotted owl. Well, they didn't. They lost their jobs because we stopped letting them cut in old growth forest, and the timber mills would not convert those absolutely humongous saws down to smaller size so that they could cut the massively abundant 12 to 14-inch trees at breast height that were out there. They didn't want to spend the money to make the conversion. They simply blamed it on this poor owl and on us. But everything that I saw was out of fear. And our job in the executive branch is to remove that fear. We have to take it away. We have to make people comfortable coming to talk to us. We have to make them feel like we will listen to them, and we are listening. And we have to make them feel like they're part of the solution. When we don't do that, we fail. It's pure and simple. And when we do that, the feeling of gratification is so great that I can't describe it to you. When it works right, it makes you feel like your whole life is worthwhile. That you've helped somebody else, and that's what life's about, is really helping somebody else. And when we do that, we've made it. The last thing I'll talk about there real quick is the citizen conservationist. That's when I came up with the title for the book of Compelled, it was because of what I'd learned in the Fish and Wildlife Service, working with federal agencies and people out there on the ground. Also, when I went to Ducks Unlimited, all those thousands and thousands of volunteers who gave and gave and gave and asked nothing back. We have 50,000 volunteers at Ducks Unlimited that helped us raise $235 million a year, and all they ever did was come to me and say, what more can I do? They were just as compelled as we were to make changes, to do things right, to leave the Creator's work there for future generations. And so we're all in this together. I respect Aldo Leopold, and he talked about the environmental citizen, that we're all just part of the environment, and we're just a citizen. We're not lords over and all of the other species, and I respect that. But nowhere in there did it really talk about this environmental citizen that does so much to give back. So I created that term in the book to recognize the people, both in government, out of government, everywhere, that work in conservation, who all they want to do is make things better. So I hope when you read the book that you will get that out of it, that it is honoring you and is honoring everyone that works in conservation. It is not about me. I say in there over and over that any accomplishments were never mine. If there were accomplishments, they were ours, because it's always the team. So if you're interested in getting the book, my wife and I decided we'd give all the money back to conservation. So there's an endowed professorship at Louisiana State University for wetlands and waterfowl conservation. So we're having all the money that it comes from the book. We don't even see it. It goes through Ducks Unlimited, given to LSU to keep that professorship going, keep training scientists, so we've got more people coming in to sit in these chairs later. And I hope it happens. If you want to buy it then, because we didn't want Amazon and Borders and those getting half the profit. So if you want it, you need to buy it either through Ducks Unlimited or through Bass Pro Shops. Johnny Morris is a great conservationist and a great friend of mine, and when he just said, what can I do to help? He said, we'll sell it. And he says, you're giving this money back, aren't you? And I said, yeah. So he said, we'll give it back too. We won't take a penny. So Bass Pro's giving all the proceeds back over to that too. So those are the two places that you can buy the book. And all 100% of the proceeds will go to try and keep conservation alive. Thank you all for everything you do. I know that we wouldn't be here without your passion and without your love for the resource, and it really makes an old man's heart feel good. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Mark Madison, and I'm here with Dale Hall, who's going to give a talk this evening about his brand new book, Compelled. Wonderful read. The subtitle is From the Yazoo Pumps to Polar Bears and Back, The Evolution of Natural Resources Conservation Law. A distinguished historian described it as exactly the type of sincere, from the trenches, environmental history that educates and inspires the next generation of conservationists.
You did a great job on
I
that.
stand by every word of that. But it's a great book, Dale. I'm really excited to have you, and you're going to talk about the book tonight, but this is a chance to just add a little extra content to it. And the first question I have for you, as a career person who moved all the way up to Fish and Wildlife Service Director, is how does natural resource conservation law in practice differ from what people read in textbooks and so on?
Well, I think that's the really interesting part of the whole story.
Yeah.
Because what you read in the textbooks is you follow this step and then do that step and then do that step, and there you have it. You have the policy, which is generally in the form of a law or regulation, and you just follow them. But what they don't understand, and you don't know until you get in it, is that almost always there was a pre-existing opposing policy. And that what we do in conservation policy is really try and take two or more policies that are out there saying to do different things with this resource, and try and find a wise spot in the middle where it is fair and reasonable and tries to comply with the will of the people, which has been expressed in more than one way. So it really is trying to figure out how to pull the pieces apart and say, all right, this is what each is trying to accomplish. There's overlap here. We know that we want flood control. We know that we want natural resource ecology taken care of. Now, how do we do both of those? So how do we work as a team? And that's not just a team within the Department of the Interior, the Fish and Wildlife Service. That's a team with the Corps of Engineers, the Bureau of Reclamation, the state agencies, everyone that might have a say in it. We need to back up and say, this is complex. And we need to understand the viewpoints that are there so that we can come up with a reasonable solution. And that's how conservation policy really works, is listening and being willing to give power away. Because I've said in the book, and I say many times, the only real power that we have is that which we're willing to share. When we share it, it grows. When we share it, we get more information, we let people to the table, and it helps a lot. And I think that is the big difference between what you might read in a textbook or a class and what happens when you have to actually start administering the policies.
That's interesting, because what you read in the papers is conflict, usually fighting. And you've actually been involved in some pretty high-profile endangered species work, including the northern spotted owl. So what lessons would you take from that experience?
That one was probably one of the most complicated of all of the issues that I got involved in my career. You start off with people coming out of World War II needing raw materials to build homes. You got to remember that the GIs coming home were given a GI Bill, which said you can get this loan for a home.
Yep.
And you don't have to have a down payment. And so all of a sudden, all of these people were eligible to have a home, but there weren't homes. So raw materials were sought after. Wood was the primary factor. So they went into all the forests of the United States, owned by the Bureau of Land Management, or operated by the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service, and started cutting timber. So all right, that policy said, give us timber. Well, in doing so, we started to ignore the ecological ramifications of that. And give us timber led into clear cuts, and clear cuts led into whole mountainsides being denuded. And of course, that's not taking care of the ecosystem. And then in comes other laws then to conflict with that. The Federal Lands Policy Management Act that operates the Bureau of Land Management, National Forest Management Act that operates the Forest Service, all say you got to have healthy ecosystems as you do this. So all of a sudden, you're dealing with conflicting policies, even within agencies, to tell them, wait a minute, what do you really want me to do with this resource? You're telling me on the one hand to provide lumber, and on the other hand to make sure that there are spotted owls and other species and healthy old growth. But the amount that you want of that timber doesn't match with what we can do. Yeah. Nature can't provide it. So in that one, what we learned is policy should be done slowly, not rapidly. And when a policy is set in motion, it should understand other policies that may be there and what kind of conflicts may occur, because the conflicts are always pointed at people, but are almost never between the people. They're really between those policies. And you have these people that like this policy because they depend on it for livelihood. Right. You have these people that like this policy because they want to see natural resource conservation. And the issue is really between the policies. The executive branch of government has a responsibility to ferret that out. And what I learned in it is that too often we go forward saying, Eureka, we need this policy to do this. And we haven't stopped long enough to see, well, wait a minute, what other directives have we put out there in the form of policies? How does this fit with that on the management of our national forest, on the management of endangered species? How do they come together? And what I learned was to help people put the brakes on, because we can solve these. Every issue that I write about in the book, as controversial as they were able to come up with a solution. Yep. Not a win, a solution. Because when there's a win, then one side lost. And political power drives policy, and as soon as that losing power gets in power again, you're going to have the fight all over again. But when you have a solution, then you actually have found something that everyone can live with. It's not everything they wanted, but everything that they can live with it as being fair and just. And I think that's the big thing that I learned about policy through the spotted owl in the Northwest Forest, was that we have to stop and realize there are no bad guys. They're just people with different opinions. And when we start listening to each other, all of a sudden, there's a little bit more respect starts to come in. And with respect comes more listening, and then all of a sudden you have trust. And when you have trust, then you can really make a difference. Unfortunately, in Northwest Forest, trust is yet to be accomplished.
Still got work to do.
Still have work to do.
This book, which I've read a couple of times, is a pretty amazing career trajectory. As you can get from the, you've done just about everything in the service.
I kept trying to find something I could do.
But then you became director, so the highest position in the Fish and Wildlife Service. And it makes me wonder, after a full career in the agency, decades in the agency, what were you most proud of as director? No doubt over those decades you must have thought again and again, boy, when I become director, I'm going to do this and that. We've all had those thoughts, but you became director. What are you most proud of, or something you're very proud of? I'm not going to make you pick your favorite
that
child.
one is the easiest question. That one is the easiest question to answer of all. I'm proud of you, and I'm proud of all of the other employees of the Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm proud of that dedicated public servant that comes to work every day, gets bashed at almost every turn by both parties, never gets thanked, but is dedicated to doing that job we just talked about and trying to find wise solutions to these very complex problems. Never going around moaning and groaning, they just roll the sleeves up and keep going. And that is what I'm most proud of. I'm most proud that I was able to be affiliated with a group of people who were truly compelled to make God's resources just a little better.
Well, that's very eloquent. I'm glad we have you speaking to all our courses out here. Nothing better. Please let them know that also. We have a long tradition. People might not know, but a lot of our directors, particularly career directors, when they retire, they don't retire. They go on to work for conservation organizations. And one of our first directors actually founded a conservation organization, National Wildlife Federation. When you left us, you went to work for Ducks Unlimited. And I'm wondering how that was a different experience, working for an NGO as opposed to working for a federal agency.
Well, I'll tell you, it was enlightening for me because I'd spent my whole career working with the career employee and seeing the dedication, hearing over and over, well, I really can't tell you the difference between what I do on my job and what I do in my spare time. It's my life. It's what I do. And so I was accustomed to that. What I was not accustomed to was the extensive amount of dedication of those private citizens out there who do something else for a living, but are equally compelled to go do something good for the natural resources, to leave their mark. And I termed in the book, I created the term the citizen conservationist. And I did that because out of respect for Aldo Leopold, he talked about the environmental citizen. And he said, we're all environmental citizens. And yet I felt like that fell short of recognizing the amount of money that is freely given in the private sector. People out of their own pockets put it into the land to create the habitat, to do all of these things. And all I ever heard at DU was, what more can I do? And what the fun part was at Ducks Unlimited is, we talk about these very difficult issues to work with. When I was with the Fish and Wildlife Service, one of the nice things was at Ducks Unlimited, if we didn't want to get involved, we just said we're not getting involved. And it really gave some, it was liberating in many ways because we could pick and choose how we got involved in something. We had taken the oath and committed that we would deal with the issues as they occurred as federal public servants. But in the not-for-profit world, we have focus on, DU had focus on wetlands and grasslands and restoring habitat. And if there were other political arguments that we didn't want to get into, we just didn't. And that was kind of nice to be able to pick and choose the arguments. But what I did find is very little difference between the dedication of the people who volunteer their time, and Ducks Unlimited has 50,000 volunteers.
Wow.
And they put on over 4,000 events a year to help raise money for habitat conservation. And all they ever want to do is to say, you know what, we're making a difference. And I think that is why I named the book Ultimately Compelled. Because I think all of us in conservation, no matter what our role, no matter where we sit in the scheme of things, if you're involved in conservation, you have a driving force within you that compels you to not be able to walk away. You have to do something, whatever you can do, to try and help move that needle and make things just a little bit better.
That raises an interesting question. So you were our first chair of the history committee that we have, and you know the history, and conservation began with all volunteers, basically, before we even had an agency. And you talked, I'm sure, to a lot of these citizen conservationists in DU, and I wonder what they told you inspired them. Was it seeing waterfowl? Was it the habitat? When they talked to you about what made them feel good, I'm curious, genuinely curious what they.
I think what I found more in the private sector, and it could be because they were free to express it, because I, as a career employee, always felt a deep affinity to my Creator, and I believe the Creator gave us these gifts, and that my role in life was to do whatever I could to try and care for and steward them. But in the federal government, you don't go around espousing that a lot, because we try to keep that separation between church and state, and it's very reasonable, and I appreciate it. In the private sector, though, it was very open. We'd have prayers before our dinners. We'd have people speak about how it was a spiritual thing for them to watch the sunrise, see that mist on the water, and hear that first 5-note quack of that mallard female waking everyone up, seeing the creation come alive and realize we've been given another day, and what we did with it was up to us. And so, by golly, we're going to do something good with it. So I think a lot of it in the private sector deals with, first, a love of natural resources. It could have come from hunting or fishing, hiking, anything. It could have been any of those. But then, in the end, it started to be something more spiritual, more very internal, that we really need to do something here to show appreciation and make sure I want my grandchildren to see this. Yeah. So I think that has a great deal to do with it. But we all want to see two things. No matter what we do, we want to know that if we give money or do work, that it's done properly and makes a good difference. But the other one is that we really want to know that we're part of something larger than any of us individually, and that together we really move the needle. I think those are common traits, whether you're in government or out of government, that we are driven to make a difference, compelled to make a difference.
I asked you what you were proudest of in the Fish and Wildlife Service. What were you proudest of when you led Ducks Unlimited?
Pretty much the same thing, that open willingness to give. You know, as a political appointee sitting in the office of the director, oftentimes people will come to my office, and I can almost tell when they're coming in, you know, what do you want? Do you want something for you? Do you want something for your party? Do you want something for someone you're representing? But usually, you know, they're coming to ask for something. Yeah. What I'd noticed at Ducks Unlimited, because it was almost all volunteer, is that when they came in, all they wanted to know was, what more can I do?
That must have been refreshing.
It was refreshing. Yeah. Although I saw that a lot in the career employees, but there were also, I did not ever have to worry about that at Ducks Unlimited. In 9 years as a CEO, I think maybe 4 times at most, someone actually wanted something in return for their volunteerism. And the volunteers, I didn't have to do it, the volunteer leadership stepped in and said, you're no longer part of these volunteer ranks. Right. They do their own policing because they're there for the same special reason, and they don't want somebody coming in trying to find something for themselves.
Well, our viewing audience doesn't know. You said, what can I do, when you came out to NCTC, and we've taken advantage of that. We have you teaching in a number of our most important classes. So you're speaking to our new employees tomorrow, and this morning you spoke to our prospective leaders in our advanced leadership class.
Very, very impressive group.
So having come up through the ranks, done everything in Fish and Wildlife Service, worked in the nonprofit world and the federal world, what advice do you give new employees and prospective leaders? My guess is it's the same knowing you. What do you tell them from your experience?
When I talk to, especially to new employees that are coming on, they don't know what they're joining.
Right.
Just like I didn't. Thankfully, I was being hired. I newly married. I had a job. That's all good. All those things. But what I tell the new employees is, stop for a moment. Take it in. You're becoming part of something extremely, extremely rare and privileged. The people that work in this organization believe that they work for the people, to take care of the people's resources, so that they can be there for the people of the future. How many occupations can you name where you can say that what I do here today, children yet to be born will be able to benefit from it? And there aren't that many, but the Fish and Wildlife Service is an extremely special family, a family that cares for each other. And if you really want to belong to something special, then set your heels in and make a home with the Fish and Wildlife Service.
That's a great way to go out, Dale. And once again, we're here with Dale Hall, who was former director in the Fish and Wildlife Service, former head of Ducks Unlimited. He's got a new book out called Compelled, From the Yazoo Pumps to Polar Bears and Back, The Evolution of Natural Resource Conservation and Law.
And the two places that you can buy it, because we're giving the money back to conservation.
Should have mentioned that.
The two places that you can buy the book are online. One is with Ducks Unlimited. Go to ducksunlimited.org/compelled, and it'll take you right to the page. The other is Bass Pro Shops. Johnny Morris is a great conservationist, and he's agreed to sell the book and keep none of the profits. All of the profits that they collect, he's giving back through DU to conservation education. So you can go to Bass Pro Shops and buy it there too. So those are the two places you can get the book online.
And the book is as eloquent and inspirational as Dale is in person. I can attest to that. So thank you, Dale, and thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.